All right, welcome to Bloomerang Academy. Thank you again so much for joining us today, where we are talking about Bloomerang automation, specifically Zapier 101. My name is Diana Otero. I'm the product marketing manager here at Bloomerang. You may recognize me if you've attended a lot of our Academy classes before, but today I'd like to introduce to you our presenter, Jessie Gilchrist. Jessie is a Zapier certified expert and Bloomerang integrations consultant at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick Solutions is a Bloomerang partner specializing in system automations, and they've actually helped put together or launch the Bloomerang Zapier app. So we're super excited to have Jessie here today to share her expertise and explore Bloomerang integrations. Welcome, Jessie.
Awesome. Thanks, Diana. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So very excited, everyone, to be here today. We love presenting on Bloomerang and especially on automations. So I kept my camera on so you could see my face, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it off now so that you can focus on the walkthroughs, because we're actually going to be doing some live walkthroughs in Zapier as well. So as Diana mentioned, this webinar today is the second in a series. So the series of webinars that we're doing is really an incremental dive into Zapier integrations for Bloomerang. So if you weren't able to attend our webinar last month that focused on exploring Bloomerang automations and use cases, Diana is going to go ahead and share the link to that in the chat. It's a great one to go ahead and watch just to get a sense of what types of custom automations can be set up for Bloomerang. It's available in Bloomerang's Academy as well as on its YouTube channel. So following today's webinar, we do have two upcoming ones that we want to highlight in this series as well. The first one is Zapier 201, and this will be on July 27th. And this is going to focus on utilities in Zapier that can be leveraged to customize your integrations further. And then in August, we are offering an Ask Me Anything style webinar where you can submit your questions about Zapier integrations and get a response from a Bloomerang and Zapier integration expert. Our hope is that by the end of this webinar series, you are able to implement automations across your organization and attain outcomes that really drive your mission and your goals. Our webinar today is going to provide an introduction to the Zapier automation platform and specifically Bloomerang's Zapier app. So we're going to start with diving into Zapier itself and then go through what are called the triggers, actions, and searches in the Bloomerang Zapier app, and then walk through the steps you would follow to get started with Zapier. So before we dive in any further, I want to do a quick poll to see how many of you have heard of Zapier before. Thank you, Diana. Give just a second for responses to come in.
So far, it looks like 47% of our attendees today have heard of it, but never used it. And an even 26% for both have heard of it and used it and haven't heard of it.
Perfect. So for those of you that are familiar with the Zapier platform, we're going to dive into it a little bit more. So some of this may be review. Let's start by talking about what Zapier is. So Zapier is an automation software. It sits between your Bloomerang database and any other apps you may use, helping them talk to each other. And this can even come in the form of automations from Bloomerang back to Bloomerang. So this is often used for different operational tasks. Bloomerang Zapier app really extends the power of your database by enabling integrations through the Zapier platform with, at this point, over 5,000 other applications in Zapier's directory. And Zapier is really designed so that anyone can build an integration, and you don't need to be a developer or no code to go ahead and set up an integration between Bloomerang and some of the other apps that you might be using. We see integrations as a key feature of your Bloomerang database, and we really see that they can take your fundraising efforts to the next level. with integrations, data should flow into and out of your Bloomerang database, connecting it to other best-in-class tools your organization plans to use or may already be using. By keeping Bloomerang as the central hub of your tech stack, you can create a global record of constituent engagement with your organization and really centralize reporting across a variety of activities or interactions that constituents have with you. Now, when we talk about Bloomerang integrations, there are two types to differentiate between: native and custom Zapier integrations. Again, if you attended our webinar last month, some of this may be a review, but it's helpful to cover nonetheless. So native integrations are often called direct integrations, and these are built within your Bloomerang software. They're often the most user-friendly form of integration and offer a standardized templated sync of data between Bloomerang and the other application. The other avenue for integration is using Zapier. And so Zapier allows you to build custom workflows that align with your organization's use case. And this is where our next webinar in the series, the Zapier 201 webinar, will really come into play, as it'll give you a deeper dive of how you can customize a flow of data to or from Bloomerang with the other apps you might be using. Now, during the last webinar, we were asked the question of when an organization should pursue a Zapier integration instead of a native integration. And we thought that this is worth covering again. So organizations typically pursue custom Zapier integrations when either no native integration exists, the native integration doesn't align with your organization's use case, or you have a high level of customization you need. Perhaps the desired functionality you're looking for between Bloomerang and the other application is not provided in the native integration. Or you want to set up an automation that strings multiple apps together. It's always a good practice to explore a native integration first, if one exists, and pursue Zapier if a native one doesn't exist or does not align with your use case. Now, before we actually dive into showing the Bloomerang Zapier app, I want to start by covering some key concepts in Zapier. So Zapier itself is a builder that allows you to design integrations using steps. And Zapier integrations are like blocks, and each block is a task in the integration workflow. So a single workflow in Zapier is called a zap. And all zaps start with a trigger and then proceed to complete one or many actions. They're a linear flow based on that initial trigger and then those subsequent actions. Now, while this looks like a very simple workflow here, these can be expanded. So zaps can be simple, or they can be expanded to include multiple steps, multiple apps, conditional logic using filters and paths, or even some data transformation and formatting. Now, we're not going to dive into those expanded functionality that expanded functionality I was just mentioning, but that will be covered in the 201 webinar coming up in 2 weeks. So in a zap, the trigger is an event in Bloomerang. So when the event happens, the trigger starts a zap or starts an automation. And each trigger event starts the zap to run and complete that subsequent set of actions. So integrations from Bloomerang can start a zap based on the following Bloomerang events. When a new constituent is created, an existing constituent is updated, a new transaction is created, a new transaction payment is created, or a new interaction is created. If I enter 3 new constituents in Bloomerang and I use the new constituent trigger, my zap will run 3 times, once for each new constituent. Now, the time it takes for a trigger to run in Zapier is based on the trigger event, and also your Zapier plan. The good general rule of thumb is that your Zap and Zapier will typically run in less than 15 minutes from the time the event occurs in Bloomerang. So if I were to create a new constituent, within 15 minutes, it should trigger my Zap and sync the data to the other application in my workflow. A Zapier action is an event that a Zap performs after it is triggered. And it can be helpful to think of an action like a task. If I were to complete the steps of my Zap manually, each step in the Zap would be a task that I would be required to do. And Zapier is automating that process by completing those same steps, but in an automated fashion. So each task is an action completed by Zapier. So generally speaking, when we're talking about actions, we're talking about writing data into Bloomerang. And there are 5 options in the Bloomerang Zapier app. We can create new constituents, update existing constituents, or we can create donations, interactions, or tasks. Now, the Bloomerang Zapier app also includes a search. So the search is essential to every Zap that creates donations, interactions, tasks, or updates constituents. Because the search in Zapier finds an existing record, and in some cases may optionally allow for the creation of a new record if none are found. And the primary search in the Bloomerang Zapier app is find constituent. So before we dive into all of these components, I actually want to look at an example Zap. So let's look at this in practice. Let's say that I want to notify my team in Slack every time a transaction in Bloomerang is entered that is greater than $1,000. In this scenario, the trigger is a new transaction in Bloomerang. And when that transaction is created, that is what will trigger my Zap. And once that Zap begins running, it'll send a channel message in Slack for each transaction that meets the criteria of my trigger. So our trigger is the creation of that transaction in Bloomerang, and our action or our task is sending the message in Slack. So I want to actually hop over to Zapier and show you what this looks like. So I have a Zap set up right here, and you'll see that the Zap itself, while it goes in a vertical format, is actually the same as this workflow or illustration I have right here. So we have our new transaction that's created in Bloomerang with a minimum amount of $1,000. And in this Zap, I'm actually sending myself a direct message in Slack, but we're going to send myself a message with the amount of the donation, the name of the donor, the fund associated with that transaction, and that I've also created a link. So if I wanted to view that transaction, I could go ahead and click that link to open it up in Bloomerang. So this Zap is on, and I want to actually show you what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my Slack over here. And we are going to open Stormy's account. And we are going to create a minimum $1,000 donation. So I'm just going to do a $1,500 donation to my unrestricted fund, and we're going to say she paid in cash. So I'm going to go ahead and save this donation. And my Zap is now going to trigger because a new transaction was created. And then it's going to perform that action, which is to send a direct message in my Slack channel. And you can see right here, I have the notification for the new $1,500 donation from Stormy Gilchrist to my unrestricted fund. And looks like my hyperlink's a little bit off. But if I had gotten my little / after edit, I would be able to click that link and open that donation in Bloomerang. So we're going to walk through the components of the Bloomerang Zapier app. But before we do that, I would love to just take a quick pause and see if there are any questions about about Zapier before we dive into the actual Bloomerang components and how you can set those up in Zapier.
Thanks, Jesse. Just a quick question here, not necessarily about Zapier. Can you, when you're setting up Zaps like this, are you limited to communicating with users within your database, or can you send information outside of that?
Yeah, so specifically, are you talking about Slack or any other type of team communication channel?
Correct.
Yes, so great question. If we were to do something like Slack, you would be able to send notifications to individuals who are not Bloomerang users. So that URL I had in the example, if they weren't a Bloomerang user, they wouldn't be able to click it and log into Bloomerang to view the details of the transaction, but they would be able to get that notification that a new $1,500 donation had been made.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and walk through the functionality and the setup of each Bloomerang trigger. So new constituent is fairly straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to trigger a Zap to run each time a new constituent is created in Bloomerang. And so this trigger allows you as the user to define whether the Zap should run when an individual is created, an organization is created, or both individuals and organizations are created. So let's go ahead and look at the setup of this trigger in Zapier. So I've got my Zapier account right here. I went ahead and logged in, and I'm going to go to the My Zaps page right here. I could click Create a Zap, but we're going to go ahead and go to the Zaps page. I'm going to go ahead and click Create a Zap. And this will start the Zapier builder or editor for me to be able to build my automation. So I'm going to search for my triggering app, which is Bloomerang. And I'm going to choose my triggering event, which is the creation of a new constituent. Now, I have already connected my Bloomerang account here. At the end of the webinar today, we're going to walk you through how to connect your Bloomerang database to Zapier, but I'm just going to go ahead and select our Sidekick Solutions sandbox. In the setup trigger section, this is where we can define if we want to only trigger for individuals or organizations. If we leave this field blank, it's going to trigger for both types of constituents in Bloomerang. A really important piece of this when using Bloomerang triggers is that once you've set up your trigger parameters, you want to go to the test trigger section and test your trigger. What this does is Zapier will ping your Bloomerang database and pull in the 3 most recently created records based on the definition we set up in our trigger. So in this case, it's going to pull the 3 most recently created individuals or organization constituents in our Bloomerang database. And what these samples allow us to do, you can see all the data that comes through with each of the 3 samples. It allows us to map this data into our subsequent steps in our Zap. Updated constituent works really similarly to new constituent. So this will trigger a Zap anytime you update an existing constituent and save it. So this can be set up similar to new constituent to run when an individual, an organization, or both individuals and organizations are updated. Now, it's important to note that this trigger will run if you update the constituent's profile. Go back to my Bloomerang database here. So if I update any information on this profile, any of the system fields, standard system fields, any of my custom fields, or if I update phone numbers, emails, addresses, or contact preferences, all of those types of updates will trigger my updated constituent Zap to run. Now for the updated constituent trigger, again, Bloomerang is my app, and I can just change my triggering event to updated constituent. It's already going to save my Sidekick sandbox. And then we can make the same decision to only trigger on individuals or organizations. And leaving this field blank will allow our Zap to trigger anytime an individual or an organization is updated. Now you'll see on the updated constituent trigger that there are 2 additional fields that we didn't have on new constituent. These are options where we can pull in additional information about the constituent into our trigger for use in the remaining steps in our Zap. So if we include the constituent's cumulative giving history, if we set this to true, this will go ahead and return the constituent's 10-year giving history, their average giving, lifetime giving, first, latest, and largest transaction details. And then the constituent household information will give us the household name, the status of the household, and any engagement score for the household as well. If we leave these empty or false, it's going to go ahead and not hydrate or not pull that information into Zapier. And you can leave these false if it's not needed for your workflow. But if you do want to include or filter on any of that information, it can be very helpful to include those in your trigger. So we'll go ahead and include cumulative giving history and household information. I'm going to go ahead and just resave Stormy's account here so we can pull her in as a sample. And I can show you how that household and cumulative giving information gets pulled in. So again, whenever we set up a trigger, we always want to test it so that it will grab a sample record and pull in the details that we want to see. So let's see here. We've got Stormy. Here's my constituent. And if I scroll down, you can see all of this data it's giving me here in Zapier that I could map to my subsequent steps. If I scroll down, you can see here starts all of my giving summary. If we hadn't have set that trigger parameter to true, this information wouldn't be included. So we have average transaction amount, first transaction details, largest transaction, latest transaction, giving by year for each of the last 10 years. And then down, and we've got lifetime, and then we have our household information. So we've got all of the details for the household here as well. So those are the 2 constituent related triggers that we have in the Bloomerang Zapier app. Again, new constituent and updated constituent. Now let's transition to talking about the transaction related triggers. So the first one we're going to talk about is new transaction. So new transaction will trigger a Zap to run when you create a new transaction and save it. Just as we filtered in the new or updated constituent triggers based off of individual or organization, we have different filters that we can set in our new transaction trigger. So we can filter by transaction type, a minimum amount, or a maximum amount. And similar to the updated constituent trigger, we can also choose to include cumulative giving history and household information. So let's go ahead and look at Zapier and pull up at Bloomerang action. So I just clicked the plus sign to add my action, and I'm going to select Bloomerang as my app. Whoops, sorry, we're still in triggers. Sorry about that. New transaction right up here. Sorry, we're back on our trigger for Bloomerang. New transaction as our trigger. So in our trigger, again, this is where we could define what types of transactions we want to trigger on. So maybe we only want to trigger on donations, pledge payments, and recurring donation payments. We can go ahead and just select those 3 types, which means if a recurring donation schedule, a pledge, or a soft credit is created in Bloomerang, it won't trigger my Zap. It would only trigger if a donation, recurring donation payment, or pledge payment were created. Now, if you want to trigger on all donation types or all transaction types, we can just leave this field blank. So you don't need to go in and select all of the options. You can go ahead and just leave it blank. We can set a minimum amount. So for example, in that Slack Zap we demoed earlier, the minimum amount was set to $1,000. So every transaction of $1,000 or greater triggered our Zap to run. We can also set a maximum amount. So maybe we want to be notified of donations between $1,000 and $5,000. And then a separate Zap sends a more detailed notification or directs that notification to somebody different if the amount is greater than 5,000. So a lot of ways to customize your trigger for the types of transactions that you want to see. Again, we can optionally include the cumulative giving history and the household information. And then when we test our trigger for these transaction-based triggers, they not only pull in all of the data from Bloomerang related to the transaction, but they also pull in all the information for the constituent as well. So you can see right here, we have all of our transaction details, but then here we have all the details for our constituent or for our donor. So you don't have to do any subsequent action in your Zap to pull in the details for the donor themselves. That will be included in the trigger from Bloomerang with the transaction details. New transaction payment triggers a Zap to run when you create a transaction and save it, but only for donations, pledge payments, and recurring donation payments. So your revenue transactions. So unlike the new transaction trigger, which will trigger to run once a transaction is created, the new transaction payment triggers to run for each payment of a newly created transaction. So we use this trigger when we need to run a Zap for each payment individually when a transaction has multiple split payments. And we're going to walk through, once I demo this in Zapier, we're going to walk through a couple of use cases of how a transaction entered in Bloomerang would look different under the new transaction trigger versus the new transaction payment trigger. So for new transaction payment, the setup looks very similar to the new transaction. The difference is that it's already predefining that it will be pulling in donations, pledge payments, and recurring donation payments only. And there is no way to set the minimum or maximum amount filter. So there is a difference between this trigger and the other one, but the setup is relatively the same. And again, it does include those optional inclusion of the cumulative giving history and the household information. So let's go ahead and look at an example that illustrates the difference between new transaction and new transaction payment. So if I were to enter a single donation for $20 in Bloomerang, each of these triggers would run once. If I were to enter a $20 donation with 2 splits, new transaction would run once, and new transaction payment would run twice, once for each split. And if I had a donation for $20 with 3 splits, in a similar manner, new transaction would run once and new transaction payment would trigger 3 times. So you can see there's this difference when you are dealing with split payments in Bloomerang and which trigger you would want to use based off of how many times you want your Zap to run. If you're running it once per transaction or once per split in that transaction. Now, new interaction is actually a new trigger in the Bloomerang Zapier app. So this component triggers when an interaction is created in Bloomerang, and you can filter this trigger to run for different types of interactions using purpose, channel, or a combination of channel and purpose. Let's go ahead and look at that here. So you can see we can set our channel to say we only want to trigger when it's in person, and the purpose is a special event. So we can define the criteria for what types of interactions we would want to trigger our Zap on. Now, if you use Bloomerang's mass email feature or the native MailChimp integration, you'll likely want to define your channels and your triggers so that it's not triggering for all of the interactions created for mass emails, just to ensure that you're not using tasks unnecessarily in Zapier. And similar to the other triggers, optional inclusion of cumulative giving history and household information. So I'd like to know if there's any questions. Oh, and I think I actually, now that I remember, I think I actually missed. I think there's one other trigger. I think it's new task. Yep, so there's a new task trigger. I apologize, I forgot to put this one in my slide deck. So similar to new interaction, for a new task, we can define a channel or purpose, specific users' tasks, or if we only want to trigger on tasks related to a specific constituent, we can set that up as well. So new task, again, this will trigger anytime a new task is created in Bloomerang that meets the criteria you have defined here in the trigger. So I want to take a pause here and see if we have any questions before we move on to Bloomerang actions.
No questions at the moment, but just reminding everyone, if you go to our Academy page, if you'd like to see more of what, or more samples of what customers have done, you can take a look at our previous Zapier Academy classes there as well. Perfect. Thanks, Jessie.
Yeah. So let's dive into Bloomerang actions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is creating a constituent. So creating a constituent is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to create a new constituent record in Bloomerang. We can write to standard and custom fields, and we can also create individuals or organizations. So when we are setting up a create constituent action, I'm going to go ahead, just so I can show mapping of fields, I'm going to go ahead and pull in a sample trigger here. There we go. Perfect. So when we are setting up our Bloomerang action, we are going to search for Bloomerang as our app, select it, and then choose our action event, which in this case is going to be create constituent. Now, the create constituent action in Bloomerang or in the Bloomerang Zapier app does require that you select whether you are creating an individual or an organization. We're going to use an individual for this demo today. And when you choose the correct or which type you want to create, it's going to go ahead and adjust the fields displayed for mapping based off of that type. Now, what's really helpful is that the ordering of these fields line up with how you would enter them when you are creating a new constituent in Bloomerang. So the fields that we map into our create constituent action, say we're going to map first name, last name, and we are going to map an email address. You can see that it maps in almost like a mail merge, or it has a similar kind of feel to a mail merge. But as we map these fields in, this identifies what fields from our trigger up here, or any preceding action we could map from as well, it identifies which fields are going to map to the corresponding field in Bloomerang. So there are two ways to complete a Zapier action, or to map to a Zapier action. You can either, we're going to go down to email because this is a great example. You can either hard code it by selecting a value from the drop downs and values presented in Zapier, or by typing in a set value that you want to assign for all constituents, or you can dynamically map a field like I've done here, which means that from my trigger, the data for that record that triggered my Zap is what will be used when we are creating our constituent. So this is where we click into the field and select, we can search and select as well, and select the field from our trigger or any preceding action that we want to map into our Bloomerang action. So Bloomerang's Zapier app and in Zapier allows us to test actions as well. So while we test the trigger to pull in a sample, in this case, when we test our create constituent in Bloomerang, and we test this, it's actually going to tell us if we can successfully create a constituent in Bloomerang or not, and it will create that constituent. So you can see it tells me a constituent was sent to Bloomerang about 1 second ago. This is my existing StoreMe account, but I likely now have a duplicate because I use the same email address. But you can see here's the one I just created. So all it's got is name and email. And then down at the bottom, you can see it was created just now by our Zapier account. So manually testing your actions as you're building a Zap is really important, because it allows you to confirm that not only is your mapping sufficient, so you can review it in Bloomerang, it'll also catch any bugs or any errors in terms of if you miss setting up a mapping to a required field, or if there's a value from your source application that doesn't align with the values you have in Bloomerang. But it is important to know that when you do click this retest or test and review, when you do that, it will actually create that record, or if it's an update action, update that record in Bloomerang. So it may require some cleanup and deletion of that record you created from your test in Bloomerang. Update constituent in Bloomerang can update the constituent's name, contact information, or any custom field for a specific constituent. So it's important to note that this action overwrites data for existing constituents, with the exception of phone, address, and email. So if we are mapping to a name field or a custom field, whatever we are mapping in our update constituent action will overwrite what exists in Bloomerang. Blank fields in the update constituent Zap are ignored. They're not going to delete or remove data. And when it comes to address, phone, and email, they're not updates to address, phone, and email won't overwrite the existing data in Bloomerang. What it does is if it's new address, phone, or email information, it will become the primary on the constituent's record, and the existing information will be demoted and become a secondary address, secondary phone, or secondary email. So let's go ahead and show an update constituent. So update constituent, again, is going to be formatted and ordered in a way that really aligns with the Bloomerang user interface. So all of our standard system fields are up here at the top. And as we scroll down and get past our address, phone, and email, we'll get to our custom fields, where it's going to have the custom field category, 2 arrows, and then the custom field name. So this is a great way that you can map or update constituent custom fields as you need to, again, based off of data coming from your trigger or any subsequent action, or sorry, preceding action. Now, up here at the top of this action, you'll see that there is one required field, which is this constituent field. We're going to talk about this here in a minute when we get to the find constituent search, So just know we're going to come back to this, but this is what tells the update constituent action which constituent is being updated. So for right now, simply note that this field is going to identify which constituent should be updated. So the create donation action is going to create a new donation. Similar to the constituent actions, we can write to standard or custom fields, and we can create a donation that contains a maximum of up to 10 splits. Now, we're not going to talk too much about split payments. That's something we'll talk about in the 201 webinar. So if that is of interest to you, I recommend registering for that webinar on the 27th. So let's go ahead and look at create donation. So again, we're going to come back to this, but similar to the update constituent, we are required to identify which constituent the donation is being created for. We've got our date and method, our amount, fund, campaign, and appeal, QuickBooks account coding if you use the native QuickBooks integration or QuickBooks desktop integration, acknowledgement status, we've got all of our custom fields. And then we can also map details related to the payment if applicable as well. So on these fields up here, so your fund, campaign, and appeal, when we click on these, it's going to present the list of values we have in our Bloomerang database. Again, this is pulling from our sandbox, so some of these probably don't align or even make much sense, but these are related to our Bloomerang sandbox that we Sidekick Solutions have. But this allows you to, again, you can either hard code by selecting a specific fund, campaign, or appeal that should be applied to every donation created by your Zap, or there are ways to dynamically code these fields. So based off of a preceding action or a lookup table. So if you have questions about how to dynamically code fund, campaign, and appeal, our 201 webinar on the 27th, apologize if I sound a little bit like a broken record, but that will be one where we will touch on that advanced functionality of how to dynamically code these fields based off of your triggering event to be able to have some more dynamic nature rather than every donation being coded with the same fund, campaign, and appeal, which is what hard coding or selecting a value would result in. Create interaction, similar to create donation, will create an interaction for a specific constituent and can write to standard or custom fields. So we're going to run through this one real quick because the setup is very similar to create donation. So we have our constituent, our date, subject, purpose, channel, and then any of our custom fields that are on our interaction as well. You've probably noticed, other than the create constituent action, all of our other actions in Bloomerang have this constituent field where we are needing to identify which constituent we are updating or which constituent we are creating a donation interaction task for. So the other one we're going to talk about here is create task. And this just creates a task for a specific user. So again, we can choose to, in this case, constituent is optional because we could create tasks that are not connected to or linked to a constituent in Bloomerang. But we then define our channel, the user, due date, subject, purpose, and if we want to send notifications. So again, very similar to if you were creating a task in Bloomerang, we can also do that through a Zapier automation. So last but not least is Bloomerang search, and this is where that constituent field is going to come into play. So the Bloomerang Zapier app includes a search step, which is essential to every Zap that creates donations, interactions, tasks, or updates existing constituents. So the find constituent search completes a search for existing constituent records based on the name and any contact information for a duplicate check. And optionally, if none are found, we can set up the search to create a new constituent. So this search looks for a single match. So let's go ahead and take a look at the find constituent search. So we're going to come down to find constituent. And this is where we can choose if we are looking for an individual or an organization. I'm going to say I'm looking for an individual. I'm going to map in my first name for my trigger, my last name for my trigger. So first name and last name are required, and then at least one piece of contact information. So in this case, I'm going to use email. Now, if you have all three pieces of contact information available from your trigger or a preceding action, we recommend mapping them all in because it will improve the success of the search. But it's looking for a match on name and at least one piece of contact information. For the search, if it matches an existing constituent, we can choose to return household information and cumulative giving history. And then, as I mentioned, there's this option down here where we can check the box to create a Bloomerang constituent if an existing one does not exist. So this essentially nests or pulls in that create constituent action that we just reviewed a few minutes ago. So we've got our search fields up here, and then I'm going to go ahead and just map a couple fields so that we can go ahead and test this really quickly. Okay. So I've mapped in my name and email up here in my search. You can see it's actually displaying that for me here. And if I test this action, it should match my existing account for Stormy and return the details. And you can see right here, it matched my existing account, which is account number 637 right here. And it returns this ID in this payload. So this ID is a unique ID specific to each constituent. Not entirely too dissimilar from account number, but this is a more kind of overarching Bloomerang system-based ID. And so this is what is used in a subsequent update constituent, create donation, create interaction, create task, if we want it or when we are required to identify which constituent that record is being created for. So this is where dynamic mapping comes into play because we don't want to create a donation every time for the same constituent. We want to select custom mapping, and from our find constituent and Bloomerang search, we want to map in what's called the ID. So this ensures that every time your Zap runs, when it finds or creates the constituent in Bloomerang and it returns that ID number, that then that donation is appended to the timeline of that founder created constituent. So now it's kind of that what's next question. And what's next is getting started. So the first step is signing up for a Zapier account if you don't have one already. So Zapier does begin with a 14-day free trial of what's called the professional tier functionality. And following the free trial, your plan is converted to the free plan until you choose to upgrade. So most organizations, and I'm actually going to pull up Zapier here and show you this. The different tiers. Most organizations start around the starter plan because the free plan only allows you to have single step zaps right here. So most organizations start with the starter plan. There are different task license limits. So there are options in these drop downs. So most organizations are somewhere between the starter and professional plans. Again, lots of drop downs in these tiers for different task allotments based off of how much volume you're syncing through Zapier. It's also important to note that Zapier does provide a 15% discount for nonprofits. So if or when you sign up for a paid plan in Zapier, we highly recommend applying for the discount. And I believe Diana is going to share that in the chat as well. So if you have a Zapier account and haven't applied for that yet, we recommend doing so. Now, once you have signed up for Zapier, the next step is to really connect Bloomerang. So to add a Bloomerang connection, when you log into Zapier and you're logged into your home page here, you're going to click My Apps over on the left. Now you can see I already have a Bloomerang connection. You won't have that when you first start. So you'll come up to the top and click Add Connection and search for Bloomerang. When you click that, it's going to ask you to authorize your Bloomerang database. If you're currently logged into Bloomerang, it's going to already tell you that, and you can just click Grant Access. If you're not logged in, it's going to present a screen like this, and you'll just need to add your username and password to connect your Bloomerang database to Zapier. There are a lot of resources in Zapier to help with developing your own automations and your own Zaps. The first place to start is to search Zapier's app marketplace. So that's zapier.com/apps right here, and take a look at if the other tools you're using are in Zapier's marketplace and available for integration. The next place to look are pre-designed templates that Bloomerang has in Zapier. So if you come to this apps page in Zapier and you search for Bloomerang, and you go, it'll take you to this Bloomerang integrations page. If you scroll down about halfway through the page, you'll see this section called Popular Ways to Use Bloomerang Workflows. These are templates that Bloomerang has set up between some other common apps that you can click the Try It button, and it will copy that Zap over to your Zapier account. And then you can customize it from there, but it's a great place to get started. The last place I'd recommend looking is Zapier's Help Documentation and Knowledge Center. There are a lot of great resources about getting started building Zaps and more key Zapier concepts than what we were able to cover today. So a lot of great information there if you're looking to learn more about Zapier. If you have an interest in learning more about Bloomerang and Zapier integrations, again, recommend you hop on our upcoming webinars. July 27th, we'll be doing a Zapier 201 that'll build off of today's webinar. And then on August 24th, we will be having kind of an open Ask Me Anything where you can submit any questions that you have, and we will go ahead and answer those live on the call. We really appreciate you attending today. If you would like to work with a consultant to set up Zaps or develop a custom Bloomerang integration to address a unique use case, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Diana for a quick poll before we open up for some more questions.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was a lot of great information, and it looks like we're getting a lot of excitement in the chat about the different examples that we showed. So if you all would like a follow-up about consulting services to set up integrations with Bloomerang and Zapier, let us know in the poll. In the meantime, let's take a look at if we have any outstanding questions. I know that Jeff was helping to answer questions as well. So Jeff, please feel free to jump in if there is anything that we may have missed.
I don't think we've missed anything, but I gotta hand it to the group that's attended today. Really strong questions and some deep dive stuff, which gets us very excited. So thank you for everyone for the great questions.
Absolutely. Jessie, would you mind sharing the slide with the upcoming?
Yeah, absolutely. Saw that one come in.
Yeah. There's a question for, is there a time frame for Google Data Studio? Joanne, are you referring to Google Data Studio being available within Zapier? We're not quite sure what you mean. Wonderful. I have a question for you, Jessie. What are some of your favorite ways that you've seen customers use Zapier?
I think there are a couple primary ones. I would say, kind of the core integrations we usually see organizations start with are email marketing, fundraising apps, and accounting. Bloomerang does have some really robust native integrations for those, but if there's a more advanced use case or the tool that you're using doesn't have a native integration, those are typically a great place to start because they're a big ROI, something where you're probably doing a lot of manual entry already. The ones that get me really excited are, to be honest, are Bloomerang to Bloomerang integrations. So ones that trigger off of a certain event or action in Bloomerang and then turn back around and do more work in Bloomerang. So if you code a field on a constituent profile that someone is a donor, when a donation comes in, we can have an automation that does that for you. Or if you have membership custom fields on the constituent profile that need to be updated with an expiration date when a membership due is paid, automations for things like that. Those are the ones that I find really fun because they're kind of the more operational tasks, but it's things that over time can take up a lot of someone's to-do list. So I find those ones a lot of fun.
I love that. I always think of that as spending time to make time. So you're setting up that task and using that time for other things that I'm sure a lot of us, a lot of you out there are wearing multiple hats. So it's really important to make full use of your time.
Absolutely.
That's lovely.
And
Thanks,
I think we
Jen.
do have I think we're hoping to do a webinar later this year on that membership one. So if any of you that Bloomerang to Bloomerang membership raised any flags of that sounds exciting, I think we're hoping to schedule one, or we have one scheduled potentially later this year. So keep your eyes out for that.
Absolutely. And we're also looking for more use cases too. These are some of the things we've seen, but if there's something you're wanting to do, let us know. I love that there was a question that came in that Jeff was like, oh, this is a great suggestion. Can you tell us more? The more detail you can tell us about how you're planning to use this or how this would benefit you, that's wonderful.
Absolutely.
We have a great example here in the chat from Molly as well. We are currently using Zapier to communicate event registrations from Eventbrite to Bloomerang and then send off a Gmail to those that are interested in registration for a specific event. That's wonderful.
Great one.
Yeah. Well, we're right at time. Thank you again, Jessie. It's always a lot of great information, and thank you everyone for all of your wonderful questions. Again, if you have additional follow-up questions, you'll receive a copy of the slides, which has Jessie's contact information as well. That has links to our upcoming webinars. And if you have any additional suggestions or use cases that you'd like for us to showcase, we'd love to showcase that too. So please let us know. Any parting words for our friends today, Jessie?
Oh, I would say with integrations, truly the sky is the limit. If you have an idea of an automation that would make a difference for you, a conversation doesn't hurt. So feel free to reach out to Bloomerang's team, to us at Sidekick Solutions, because we'd love to explore if there's a way to solve your use case. That's what we all love doing. So our door is open. I know Bloomerang would say the same thing. Please don't hesitate, reach out and let us know. We want to help you solve whatever challenge or pain point you're facing, or just if you have a grand vision of how you want something to work, reach out and let us know.
Absolutely. We're very excited how you can extend your capabilities and bring all of it together with the tools that we have for you.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much again for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.